So hello, welcome back to our workshop on sustainability reporting. My name is Marco Becht. I also wear two hats, no hat at the moment actually, but I normally have two hats. So one is I'm a professor of finance at the Solvay Brussels School here in Brussels, where I'm now at. And we have, in fact, one of our master's programs has a new sustainability sustainable finance pathway, which teaches master students about economics. This is brand new. And I'm also the executive director of ECGI. Now, the panel we have, our panel one, the first of our stakeholder panels this afternoon, will provide you with a global perspective. And to provide you with that perspective, we're very privileged to have with us Sandra Boss, who's here, I can see her on the screen. She heads the global stewardship efforts of BlackRock, and BlackRock, of course, needs no introduction. They were mentioned as one of the investors who've given opinions on this, and they often do in the IFRS consultation. We also have somebody who's been described by IFRS as a thought leader, and I can subscribe to that, and that's Bob Eccles, who has been with the Harvard Business School and many other things, but at the moment he is mostly attached to the Saïd Business School in Oxford, and he's published numerous things on these subjects, and he's he was one of the first people to draw attention to this very important topic. So we're very privileged to have both of them with us. I think Sandy will first share her views, then Bob, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we move to the general discussion. So thank you, Sandy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco. It's great to be here today. So let me start with why we care about sustainability disclosure, because I think the context is important. Larry's letter, people tend to read Larry's letter to CEOs at the beginning of this year. It was all about our commitment to sustainability as a new approach to investing. And that was very much because it's our firm conviction that sustainability risk, particularly climate risk right now, is an investment risk. And I think the events of 2020 have absolutely confirmed that for us. So you see the increased physical risk, you see the transition risk that at some times we despaired whether transition risk would come soon enough. Now we're actually seeing country after country make significant commitments. It's definitely a live issue for all companies. But furthermore, we've also seen not just environmental issues this year, but the social issues associated with the pandemic have been really, really significant, with tremendous implications, not just for lives and livelihoods, very important, but also for investments and for the long-term value for our clients. So we and others have done quite an amount of research this year and in the past. I think that's a body of research that's developing that demonstrates that sustainability integrated investments provide better risk-adjusted returns for investors, for our clients. And that's something that we firmly believe. So what does that then mean in terms of how we invest and how I do stewardship and we do stewardship on behalf of our clients? From an investment perspective, sustainability disclosures enable us to express this investment conviction. If we can understand and differentiate amongst companies, we're then able to form portfolios that allow us to express that belief, that proven belief that risk-adjusted returns can be superior while taking into consideration these sustainability effects. Also, obviously, we have clients who have long-term goals, such as migrating toward a low-carbon economy. They want to have portfolios that are transitioning, and we need sustainability disclosures to make that a reality. In stewardship, which is the group that I now lead, we are invested as a long-term investor in most of the large companies around the world. 90% of BlackRock's equity and holdings are in index. So that means that we'll hold a company in that portfolio on behalf of clients for as long as it's in the index. That's 20 times longer on average, and it might be in an active portfolio. So it means that we need to work on how do we ensure that there's good corporate governance and sustainable business practices in those companies. We do that by working with academics, regulators, other investors on trying to get the right standards. That's why we're here today. We also engage with companies quite extensively and use our vote. We do all the proxy voting, or much of the proxy voting, out of my group. So our goal ultimately is to use these sustainability disclosures in the service of our clients, helping them meet their long-term investment goals. So I should say a minute, what are we looking for? I think many of you know, we came out at the beginning of this year very firmly asking for two things. One was TCFD aligned disclosures. The other was SASB disclosures. And we did that for a very clear reason. On the TCFD, it's able to give us what we need to understand that companies have a plan for how they are managing that transition to a low carbon economy. So it gives us the risk analytics, it gives us the scenarios, it gives us the data around the targets that the company's setting. Again, give us the confidence that that company is managing both the climate risk and opportunities. SASB, as some of your other speakers have said, clearly we've got material, relevant, business specific and sector specific information that matters to us as investors as we're thinking about differentiating amongst investments. We have been incredibly heartened by how quickly both of these two metrics are taking off this year. So the 1,500 TCFD supporters this year, fantastic news. I think everyone's seen the incredible rate of increase that SASB has seen this year, 400% increase I've seen. Maybe it's 3.8 times, but it's a really, really big increase. And we're also seeing a lot of regulators support these now, UK, other jurisdictions. I sit in the UK, but it's something that, New Zealand, we're starting to hear about it in the EU as well. We really, really are heartened by the direction of travel amongst the private standard setters. So the 5-way tie-up that was announced in September, working toward a comprehensive global corporate reporting system. I think that is an absolutely fantastic development. Are further heartened by the recent announcement of SASB and IIRC merging, the possibility that CDSB joins. And in the context of the IFRS Foundation consultation, we will be responding, and we absolutely believe that is the right home. We think that the IFRS Foundation has the right standard setting domain expertise. Very, very importantly, it has the ability, working with regulators from its traditional financial seat, to be able to establish a global standard and get it embedded in international and national practices. It's very important that it be done correctly from a governance and from a resourcing perspective. Speaking as an investor, we want to make sure that in that standard setting governance body that the investor voice would be reflected, as well as corporates and accountancies, of course. We also know that the resourcing here isn't yet what it would need to be. This is a new discipline. And clearly the right answer, as IFRS has suggested, will be to build on the work of the 5 standard setters, not to reinvent the wheel. A point about dynamic materiality, I think that's a fantastic idea. Clearly we're all recognizing now that some sustainability risk has already worked its way into the financial statements, and both the IASB and the IAASB have recently come out with something that we very much support, which is that companies, particularly when it comes to material natural resource businesses that have climate risk embedded in their accounting statements and in their assumptions, they need to be really thinking about whether they have appropriately reflected a long-term expectation on climate risk into those financial statements. Adjacent is the opportunity that we see for this new SSB that's been proposed. We really think that should concentrate on materiality. It should start as proposed with climate risk. We welcome the opportunity that will build into other material areas going forward. We do think that in the third category that's mentioned in the 3-way diagram, that the many, many other important sustainability issues should indeed be cared about, reported on. There's a wonderful ecosystem. GRI is obviously the most accepted standard in that area. And sitting next to this SSB, coordinating with it and actually helping to be a front runner and an idea generator for where the SSB should go next, we think that's a great opportunity. So look, I've never been more heartened. I think we're going to get into the issues around what will Europe do, and that is the magic question. We're incredibly hopeful that what Europe will do will be to, much as in the terms of reference for the FRAG, try to think about how to give life to these private sector standards, to come up with a mechanism where Europeans can comply with the regulation and also use these types of standards. But essentially this is an amazing moment for those of us who are not entirely in the EU to have a global standard. And we really want to build on the momentum and are hopeful that Europe can help us with that effort. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sandy. So, Bob, I think we turn straight to you. I think you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
So that's not my fault. Somebody
we can hear you now. Start again.
There you go. So I was saying I'm a big fan of the Sustainability Standards Board. If you would have told me 2 years ago that the IFRS Foundation was thinking about this when Richard Barker and I were writing our little green paper, should FASB and ISB set standards for non-financial information, I would have thought I was having a flashback or something to the 1960s. I could never imagine this was happening. So I think it's an enormous step forward. I agree with Sandy. I want to make 4 quick points, but let me say, compared to Christian, I mean, economics, finance, accounting, like I'm a nobody, right? Like I have a PhD in sociology, so I'm just lucky to be on this conference with the rest of you. Maybe I'm here because I've been wandering in this wilderness for over 30 years, even before the GRI was formed. And I do agree. I think this is a particularly fantastic moment in time. But let me give a couple of perspectives on some things that have come up in the previous discussion, because I've listened into all of them. My first point is that standards are a social construct. These don't come from physics. These are invented by people. They're imperfect. IFRS is a social construct. It's how most of the world agrees to look at the financial performance of a company. US GAAP is the US version, the typical US exceptionalism. They're not perfect. Christian said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Financial accounting isn't perfect, and it's not complete. Companies do non-GAAP earnings. I know Sandy Boss is on this. We've talked about this before. So I think we need to take that same approach with the Sustainability Standards Board. These are social constructs, and they're not going to be perfect. And there's nothing about this that's going to prevent companies from reporting other information that would go outside the realm of single materiality. And I've always found this double materiality kind of an awkward term, but it is what it is. But in terms of double materiality, I think it's important to recognize the system level effects. That's really what the debate is about. I think in a lot of ways, this is really the contested terrain. But if you look at the asset management industry today, that's enormously concentrated. The top 5 have about 25% of assets under management. The top 10 have about a third. As Sandy was saying, you know, they're mostly passive. They've got long-term timeframes. So they're universal owners. The big pension funds are universal owners. And so it's telling that they want TCFD reporting from BlackRock for all the companies, whether SASB says it's material or not. So when you think about those really large asset managers and then the asset owners that give them their mandates, I think that a lot of the concerns that people have around double materiality, you'll find that even in the work, the way that the Sustainability Standards Board is proposed to be constructed, these things will be picked up by these large universal owners just because they can't diversify themselves away from system level risk. Third point, Christian talked about infrastructure. I think that's important. Disclosure is not a silver bullet. It depends on how people use the information. Companies can be disclosing it, and even if investors think it's useful, if they don't do anything about it, if they don't engage with companies, not much is going to happen. And again, you see a big trend on engagement and stewardship. I know BlackRock is staffed up. You know, that's a lot that Sandy's doing. She can talk about it better than I can. So we need to have engagement. We need to have active stewardship from the investment community if these numbers are going to be made available. And the portfolio managers need to start talking to the CEOs and the CFOs. And I think probably CFOs are one of the biggest constraints in this. It's another story. This needs to become part of the conversation between the asset owners and the asset managers. I think other things we need to think about are the mandates that the asset owners give the asset managers. If these mandates are short-term and the benchmarking is simply financial performance, the asset managers aren't going to have the right incentives to engage with the companies. And kind of to go outside the reservation from what this conference is about, yes, companies are talking about purpose. I'm a little cynical about how real it is. I think ultimately, personal opinion, we need to get to public benefit corporations. I mean, Adrian was kind of teasing that up. Today in the United States, directors may take account of ESG or sustainability issues if they can argue for long-term value creation, which they often do. They don't have to. In a public benefit corporation, they would have to. Jaap Winter, Colin Mayer, Leo Strine wrote a lovely piece in response to Milton Friedman's letter on the 50th anniversary. So I think if you look forward and you think about what the work of the IFRS Foundation would be, and if you think about how Adrian was presenting it, in a world of public benefit corporations being the norm, not the exception, I think that's different. Last point, we've talked largely about environmental issues, almost exclusively about environmental issues. I get it on climate change. What we haven't talked about is income inequality. And I can tell you, when I talk to big investors and you say, what are the system level risks that you're concerned about? They say two things. They say climate change and they say income inequality. And they'll often say that income inequality is destabilizing the system. It can bite us harder and faster. It's related to climate change. How do you get your arms around income inequality? I don't know. I'm doing some work in this area. Other people are. I know a group that's thinking about trying to create an income inequality equivalent to the TCFD. Really important. It's in the double materiality realm. I can't imagine that that's something that a sustainability standards board should try to grapple with. I think there's other groups that can. They can make progress, and then the investors, these universal owners, if they start to want to have reporting on that, the groundwork will have been done. But you've got to, again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You got to get to the moon before you get to Mars. And so I'm wholehearted agreement with where the Sustainability Standards Board wants to start. But Erkki said it himself in Lucrezia. I mean, it's going to be in a larger ecosystem. There's other organizations that will continue to do work, and I'm sure that the SSB will collaborate with them.
You're on mute.
Marco.
Now, Bob, I did not press the button this time. Okay, so we are even. So let me start by asking a question to each of you, and maybe just start with you, Sandy. So I think we kind of understand how a sustainability standards board and the global standards it would develop would influence the weighting on index products, provided that the index producers actually built this into the index and people want to track those indices. So that, I think, is quite well understood. I think what's still less understood, and if you could maybe just, to make it a bit more real and practical, elaborate a little bit on, assuming that a sustainability standards board would be created and these standards, how would that affect the stewardship work that you're doing? What would that change in terms of the engagement work, for example, that you're doing at BlackRock?
Well, I think it could be profoundly effective. So the biggest challenge that we have today is when we think about prioritization, assessment, and of a company, and then assessment of impact. In each case today, we're impeded by the same thing, which is a lack of quality data and a lack of comparable data. So we prioritize using what we know about companies and using our own analytics, which draw on a host of different ESG indicators. But then we find the prioritization gets us only so far. We engage with the companies, we look at their disclosures. Our work is very, very manual. So we now have 50 people in our group today around the world, 7 different locations. They're operating in all kinds of regimes, all kinds of disclosures. Often it's as simple as the companies will produce a sustainability report 4 months after the voting season, and it's not tied to when we're actually needing to make decisions on the company. But there are many other challenges. And then ultimately, if we really want to understand whether the time that we're spending with companies, whether our votes are effective, what we really want to see is time series analytics, where we can compare populations of companies over time in terms of metrics that we have researched and know are linked to better investment performance, and see how the progress of engagement and the progress of voting then correlates to changes in those metrics. That will then inform our investment theses, but it will also give us the confidence that the time that we're spending is ultimately valuable in meeting our objective, which is to have long-term value creation on part of our clients, most of whom are investing for decades and decades against significant long-term either retirement or other savings goals. So that ability to have comparable information, it would be absolutely invaluable for us.
Great, thank you. So we have the first question from the first participant question. So let me read it. It's from Austin Kennedy. And the question is, in terms of infrastructure, can you comment on building up capacity for SMEs for non-listed companies that don't necessarily fit into the IFRS mandate? So I don't know who of the two of you would like to take this. Maybe you, Bob, and then because Sandy's already answered, so then Sandy can come in as well if she wants.
So Austin, it's a good question. It comes up a lot. You know, it's kind of tough, right? I mean, the SMEs, they have to do financial reporting. They've got to do it for banks. So I don't think it's a huge lift. I think this is why the single materiality is probably a good place to start. I'm not saying the SSB should, use SASB necessarily, but on average for the 77 industries, it's about 5 or 6 material issues. And so I don't think that's too hard of a heavy lift for SMEs. And I would argue that they need that information anyway. A lot of companies are now held by private equity firms. We haven't talked about them. A lot of interest in the private equity industry and building the capacity in their portfolio companies to put these metrics in place. So yeah, I think both non-listed and SMEs, I think from a single materiality point of view, it's quite doable and it's a good place to start. And another reason I think that the SSB should start with single materiality, but everything everybody else has said about dynamic materiality and stuff, I think is important.
Okay, thank you, Bob. I think Christian Lloyds would like to ask a question direct. Christian.
Well, I was going to actually probe a little further into this question, which I think was a really important question about the smaller companies and the private companies. Given that we're dealing with a global problem when it comes to climate and many of these environmental issues, I think it is a serious concern to what extent the activity will then migrate to private companies, and thereby we get sort of take the pressure, we put the pressure on the public companies, and then we have evasion of some sort by activities going towards the private firms. And where we, for instance, see something like that, disclosure of extraction payments, there's an interesting study that shows when we put the spotlight on the extraction payments, you see how the European companies that had to face that disclosure regime, how that affected their activities. But then other companies that were not subject to the disclosure of extraction payments were picking up some of that activity that was basically left by the European companies. And so I fear that something similar could happen with the private companies. And I would want to hear a little bit more about how we could counter this issue. Thank you.
I think you can.
Yeah,
so real quick, you got one
on that, or
go ahead, Sandy. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, they're both coming in. Okay, so you go first, Sandy.
Sure. So I'd like to make 2 observations. I think the first important, at least in the climate arena, migration issue that we have is geographic climate migration. And I do think that one of the most important things that we and other investors can do is to make sure that we're not just engaging with European and Western companies that already have excellent disclosures, increasingly improved disclosures, and many of whom are setting targets. And we engage quite extensively in Asia with very carbon intensive companies, and we're increasing our universe, thinking about almost 1,000 companies now that are priorities for us. It represents 90% of scope 1 and 2 in our clients' portfolios. So we really think that geographic migration is important. When it comes to then private markets, one of the routes that we have to think about is debt financing. So what we're trying to do is work with our fundamental investors who are there at the heart of the active underwriting decision for debt, to be able to address in the equation of whether to do that underwriting, what is the ESG integrated set of questions that they need to ask. And to the extent that I think, at least for us, we can work with our fixed income investors on that subject, we can then increasingly expand the universe where those can be voluntary metrics. I don't think there's a mechanism for ensuring that they're all mandated. The third possible route to solving this problem, and I was meeting with a big bank yesterday, would be banks beginning to embed an expectation of some of these sustainability standards into their bank lending practices, because most SMEs at some point do need financing. And so the more that any of the big financiers, whether it be listed equity, listed debt, private debt, the more that we need to ask these questions, I think the more that we'll get these type of standards embedded into processes. But I would say, coming back to Bob's point about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, if we can do a good job of getting, the SSB set up with strong integrated reporting for listed companies, I think that will have ripple down effects, and I would be hesitant to try to do everything simultaneously.
Bob,
So there's
on SMEs, huh?
Yeah, and it's talking because a lot of those are held by private equity firms. There's $1.7 trillion, as they like to say, in dry powder. So it matters at a system level. So I think what you need is the LPs need to get more spine, and they should ask for more disclosure from these, GPs. And they've been reluctant in the past. They say, gee, they'll cut our allocation. I'm thinking, what a great business to be in. Your clients are afraid of you. Now, that's changing. But I've gone to a number of private equity firms about this consultation. I've said, you should weigh in. I think it's important. There's a Swedish private equity firm called EQT I wrote about. They've got SASB, they've got, TCFD, they've got SDGs at all the portfolio companies. The data are there, it's doable. And I don't think it's too much to ask of the big private equity firms to say, make public disclosures. I get it, you won't do the financial stuff. Make public disclosures, of your sustainability performance. Having a sustainability standards board would be the platform to do it. So I think absolutely we need to put pressure on the private equity industry, and I'm doing it in every way I can think of.
Alan Deckers from the European Commission also had a comment on SMEs. Alain, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Just a comment on SMEs. I think SMEs are increasingly going to be asked for not just financially material information related to sustainability risks, but also about others, because whether it's the banks will be asking them to try to understand also what risks they're taking on, and of course there is a feedback effect, or there can be a feedback effect between externalities and internal financial risks. Insurers are going to start looking at this as part of their underwriting activities. Their clients, which may be large companies that I suspect in the future will increasingly be subject to statutory due diligence requirements. Certainly in Europe, that's looking like a strong possibility. Will ask for this type of information. So that's not to say that we necessarily need to mandate these kind of disclosures for all SMEs, but I do think that increasingly those SMEs will be resources to provide quite a wide range of sustainability-related information, in addition to the private equity investors, of course, who are also a potential player in this area.
Yeah, so let me add one comment and then move to another question related to this. So our first comment is that, of course, the US and Europe are different. In Europe, the disclosure requirements for non-listed companies are much larger. So there is, in addition, of course, also the question of level playing field and jurisdictional mobility and corporate mobility and all these kind of things, which sort of leads us to the next question by Herman Mulder, who asks, shouldn't we include true pricing practices in the value chain of listed companies to be reported? So the more general question, I guess, is supply chains. Even if we target these standards at the large companies, what would the Sustainability Standards Board do in terms of supply chains and reporting on the application of the standards through the supply chain? I mean, we don't know what they would be doing, but what should they be doing? Do you have any thoughts on this? Maybe Bob and then Sandy.
So two thoughts. Number one, I mean, it raises the obvious question of the reporting boundary, and the reporting boundary in, financial accounting is the firm. GRI looks more broadly than that. So one of the things that the SSB would have to think about is reporting boundary. And then, thinking back, I'm not going to get into it, but Christian's talk was really thoughtful. And it's like, okay, if this is material, could just IFRS handle it? The true value, Herman, you're talking about, the impact weighted accounts, what Adrian was talking about. I mean, some of these things conceivably could be picked up within financial accounting. I mean, that's what George is working on with Ronnie in the impact weighted accounts initiative. And I think I'm not ready to go there yet. I think, again, step by step. So I think drawing kind of the boundaries in the remit, kind of reporting boundary, and then kind of what goes into an SSB and what you want to think about sort of adjusting the financial accounts. I don't know the answer, but I think those are important questions.
Okay, so let's then perhaps move on to another topic, which of course is always related. And the next question comes from Guy Jubb. So he asks, what role do index providers, which are increasingly important in investment strategy and portfolio construction, have in determining the suitability of standards and in providing motivation to companies to meet and exceed standards? So I guess this goes back to the weighting question and the fact that who actually provides indices and who decides which indices we are tracking. So maybe we start with you, Sandy.
Certainly. Well, look, I think clearly it is ultimately the role of the index provider to specify indices, but I think we and any significant producer of index-based products are spending a good deal of time right now working with the index providers, asking them to increasingly express the investment convictions that we have and that are being requested by our clients in the formation of new indices. I mean, I think that there is a migration away from purely exclusionary type of indices toward thinking about some more sophisticated weighting associated with sustainability characteristics. Mostly we are doing that in our active products as opposed to that being produced by the index provider themselves. But it's certainly an area of discussion. And I do think that the more that we can get core indices to be produced that any investor can use in their product suite that are already expressing some of these sustainability goals, I think that's going to be beneficial for the industry. There is progress. And I think it's there. The index providers, in our observation, are increasingly aware that they have a very important role to play here in this area.
Yeah, and maybe just as a footnote, I think we've seen ECGI working papers come out with research that shows that actually these things now are starting to get priced in. So all of this goes in the right direction. So Bob, do you have a comment on this point?
No, I'm good. You can take more questions.
Okay, so let me then move down the chain. Oh, the next question is for you, directly for you, Bob. So there you go. So it's from Samir Trebelzi, Professor Eccles. Given that we are dealing with a global problem and given COVID-19, should we start by surveying sustainability reporting practices and then come up with the widely accepted practices? This way we can ensure both materiality and proper implementation. We know that the number one challenge for IFRS standards was proper implementation.
So, I mean, it's a good question. I started to just type an answer and then I didn't get around to finishing. So thanks for the question. I think it's probably a good place to start. I think you've got to be cautious because you're sort of assuming that companies know what's material. COVID-19 has made social issues much more prominent. So people are kind of behind the curve on that. If their performance is bad and they know it, they're not going to want to disclose it unless you've got mandatory reporting, which I think you need. We finally are recognizing this. And so I think knowing kind of the state of existing practice is a good idea. But I'd be a little bit cautious in putting too much emphasis on that in terms of what the SSB should be focusing on. I would look more at the user community, the investors, as opposed to what the accountants like to say are prepares, which reminds me of the motto of the US Marines, why civilians exist, which is for the Marines to protect them. I think accountants think that companies exist so that they can prepare financial statements to be audited. That's the role of companies, Marco, to be preparers in the accounting world, just so you know.
Okay.
Could I compliment what Bob was saying on this? I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem in terms of deciding what is material, which is until we're able to see more of the data associated with the risks that we believe are material, I think we will not have the kind of analytics that we need to be able to weight and assess those and over time demonstrate in which circumstances those remain material. So what's good about the current process is it is very consultative. It involves a lot of investors and companies. So the formation of a standard doesn't happen in space, but as yet we're not able to compare the way that we really could over time. So I do think that one of the things that the SSB can do over time is to be able to continuously assess, the materiality of the standards in its staple. And that is an opportunity where I think having investors at the table as well could actually be quite beneficial.
Okay, so I think we can take one more question for each participant. So maybe Christian, Lucrezia, Dirk, do any of you have a question for our panel? Dirk.
Yeah, let me unmute myself. One big question, and especially Bob, you have been involved with all the initiatives which are around. The IFRS wants to stand on the shoulders of these giants. How would you see these dynamics going? How could we move? How can we build on the experiences of all the existing initiatives which are around today?
So let's cut to the chase on this. I mean, you know that I was the founding chairman of SASB, and I was involved with the founding of the IRC, and the guys who started are buddies of mine, so I know everybody. Short version, 3, 4, 5 years from now, SASB, CDSB, IRC, they're out of business, right? You know, the work they've done, it's wonderful, it's great. It's been absorbed in some fashion into the Sustainability Standards Board. CDP is a data platform. GRI has an incredibly important role going forward as an independent organization focusing on externalities, double materiality. So organizationally, the outcome seems clear to me. The mechanics for getting there, I'm sure, complicated, but I don't want to have the SSB added to SASB and IRC and CDP and so forth. That's not what we're talking about.
Thanks.
Sandy, you want to comment on this point, or you prefer not to?
Can I say something on a slightly?
Of course, Lucrezia, yeah, of course,
topic?
Please.
I mean, I liked almost everything I heard in this panel in terms of, you know, where we are going, and we should look at this in a dynamic perspective also because, you know, we are building something very new also in terms of data and practice. There is an issue, however, of what should be the governance of this process. And okay, the IFRS has certain advantages because it's a public-private, you know, kind of collaboration. It's a complicated governance, however, and you know, and this should be appreciated in a sense that you know our three-tier structure is such that we have a role for regulators. So, for example, you know, building on what Christian said, we want an infrastructure. Yes, of course, we want the infrastructure. You know, accounting standards cannot do everything, right? So, the fact that IOSCO is part of the monitoring board of the IFRS, that's important, okay? Because that means that, you know, they will have something to say. Now, so I can see how this has some advantages, but there is another aspect which probably we will touch on the panel on the EU perspective, which is because the infrastructure, you know, there is a regulatory infrastructure, but then there is also the legislative things, the public policy things, and so on. So some heterogeneity, it will be inevitable. So we need to build a governance that will allow that flexibility so the different jurisdictions will go at different speed, but in a way that will not prevent some level of dynamic convergence going forward. And to that extent, I think there is a little bit, you know, extra piece of analytic thinking to think of what to have the most ambitious jurisdiction, you know, within the governance of the global standard setters, because ideally we want to converge to the most ambitious ones.
Okay, so we've almost run out of time, so I think we can have a last word from you, Sandy and Bob, if there's any last word you'd like to say to close the panel. Sandy, maybe you go first.
I guess what I'd say, and it's consistent with the discussion we've just been having, is we think it's incredibly important that the private sector effort currently underway continues at pace. We will keep looking for the measures that we're looking for now, TCFD, SASB, that will be, you know, unrelenting on our part because it's the best thing that we have right now while this convergence is taking place. And then I would say, agreeing with the comments made by Bob and Lucrezia, that trying to think now about what is the least cumbersome, most effective governance model for this new set of standards. We don't want a 20-year process for us to get to, you know, the perfect mechanism exactly analogous to the financial reporting standards. I mean, that may happen and it may take that long, but in the meantime, how can we start to make progress on taking, for example, the climate risk issue as one that there is agreement, there's urgency, there's methodologies, and really trying to learn from that, pilot that, and then how can we roll out, you know, learning on that in terms of a broader governance approach, and then how we might bring in other material items. So really trying to keep those private standards going while we begin to bring something together under the IFRS would be my recommendation.
Bob?
So real quick, let me just echo what Christian said. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, I get it that the materiality issue is the most important, fundamental, contested terrain. I completely respect what everybody is saying about arguing for double materiality, but I don't think we should have that expectation for the Sustainability Board to start for the reasons that Sandy just said. That doesn't mean it's ignored. That doesn't mean that companies don't report on it. Having mandated sustainability reporting standards doesn't preclude people from reporting on sustainability issues that matter to society. And so let the Sustainability Standards Board get started. Let it walk before it runs. As Ricky said, standard setting is a slow process. We've got to speed it up. So let's, you know, get this going, have the SSB collaborate with other organizations, and get on with it. And remember, this is a social construct. There's no perfectly right answer, but we need standards so we can have a common conversation. Like Sandy was saying, we don't argue about what revenues are. Let's quit arguing about how to measure carbon emissions.
Okay, so this brings us to the close of the first panel on the global perspective. I think the message was clear from both Sandy standing in for investors and from Bob, that it would be desirable to have global standards. Once we have them, of course, there'll still be issues about listed versus non-listed supply chains, all these sort of things, but the general thrust is clear. It was also clear, I think, that in this, Europe is needed. Because Europe is so far ahead on all these issues. And after all, it's the Paris Climate Accord. And this very topic we shall discuss in about 3 minutes after this very little break at 5 o'clock sharp Central European time. So thank you again, Sandy. Thank you, Bob. I thought that was really interesting and excellent. Thank you.